Thank you for staying with us. Our next interview, we're talking about sports, and we're speaking specifically about racism and discrimination within sports. We have with us Brian Lewis, who is the former TTOC President. He's also an advocate and so much more. Welcome to studio, Brian.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you.
If I may slip in quickly,
Yes.
most important too in the whole conversation about racism is I'm also chair of the Sport Integrity Global Alliance Gender, Race, Inclusion and Diversity Committee.
Nice.
So that deals specifically with issues of discrimination and being and non-racism and non-discrimination in the global sport movement.
Okay, good, because we're going to talk about inclusion shortly, as well as discrimination. March 21st marked the day of observance by the UN, International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the theme really focused on the urgency of combating racism and discrimination. Let's talk about sports. You know, with your experience, with your expertise being in sports for this length of time, you have seen this, and how has this played out? What does racism and discrimination look like in sports?
All right, so before I answer the question,
Yes.
I just wanted to tell you, wow, I found it was so interesting that your inspiration quote of the day is, stop sleeping on yourself.
Yes.
And the reality is that people in sport need to stop sleeping on themselves.
Okay.
Right, they need to stand up and speak out against the affront and stain of racism. So we all watch sport and we all understand the power of sport
Yes.
as defined by the iconic Nelson Mandela. We all participate in sport. But because we kind of focus a lot on the entertainment part of it, we fail to acknowledge, maybe because it makes some of us uncomfortable, the reality that sports in a very real way continues to be a manifestation of systemic racism, discrimination, and the maintenance of the racist infrastructure ideologies that pertain in the world. So it's a very important and necessary conversation, because you watch a lot of times, and maybe even you will be guilty of it, and you see footballers in Europe
Right.
being pelted with
Yes.
bananas, being taunted, the Nazi signs being made. So it's not as if people aren't
Aware of what's
aware
going on.
that racism, in particular in the European-dominated sport and sport organization, is very much a real thing. But we turn our eyes from it and play that we don't see, we don't hear, and therefore we don't speak about it.
Right. I think what you said was really important in terms of not the entertainment aspect of sport, because while it might be entertaining for some, this is a lifestyle, this is a career for others. Tell us how you've seen racism and discrimination play out locally and within the region.
Well, the truth be told, in the Caribbean, there are those who would suggest with validity that it's more classism rather than an elitism, rather than racism.
Okay.
But the reality is, because as a region, we identify so much with the exploits and successes and failures of our athletes and our sportsmen and sportswomen, whether Trinidad, for example, the Hazley Crawfords, the Arthur Boldens, the Walcotts, Keyshawn Walcotts, and the Dylan Carters, the Soca Warriors. The reality is that, you know, if you recall 2 years ago, the racial indignities, slurs, and insults the Trinidad and Tobago football team suffered when I think they played Mexico. So what it is that it's there because we expose our youth and young people who represent the red, white, and black to the reality of the big world and the racism. And because we don't want to discuss it, it sometimes focuses on us, it comes across as a bit of a shock.
Right. How, before we go into how it's treated right now, right? Not what we want it to be treated as, but how does it affect the players? How does it affect the athletes when these things happen?
Well,
And also their performance as well, too.
well, any human being who is subjected to an insult or slur would be impacted.
Yes.
The reality is that all of us, we deal with things, each of us, you would deal with something differently to how I will deal with it. You may be more resilient. I may not be as resilient given a particular situation. But you have seen, for example, in Europe, we have footballers who have been taunted on the monkey chance that they
Yes.
walk off, they feel it because it impacts you.
Yeah.
You have seen those who react by throwing back the banana
Yes, we've seen that.
and go on to score a goal. And in other words, the best revenge is massive success. I think Les Brown once said that. I know that I once went to an international sport meeting and put my hand out to shake someone's hand, and they watched it and ignored it in the presence of people, and I felt a bit embarrassed
Right.
and humiliated. And at that time, I was waiting for an elevator with a group of white people at an international sports meeting, which is supposed to be friends and everything.
Yes.
And when the elevator came, they did not get into the elevator. Again, I felt a little embarrassed and humiliated, but you develop the resilience to know who you are, and you know that it says more about them than you.
Right.
Not everyone is at the emotional and mental and psychological maturity stage to be able to shake that off. It
Yes.
impacts you.
In the moment especially. Yeah.
Huh?
I said in the moment especially.
In the moment,
Yeah.
especially, and it could throw you off. So, and it's not ideal, you know. So, the thing is that if you don't identify that we have issues or acknowledge it, then you can't begin to solve it.
Right. How do we treat with it now? Not just in terms of policy and legislation, but also in terms of amongst the teams. How do we treat with it right now?
Again, for me, it's also about awareness first. You're aware of the situations, and therefore you inform how to deal with it mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. So a simple thing, you know, we don't like to acknowledge the past. And Marcus Garvey once said that a people who don't know their history, culture, and origins, you are like a tree without roots.
Yeah.
And it is important to acknowledge that because of colonialism and slavery in particular, and the history of that, the system is very much built a particular way, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. Remember, back in the days of slavery, there was a slave code, 1661, the Barbados Slave Code, which legislated, legalized the view that black people of African descent, the slaves, were non-human, heathens and brutes. So you have to understand that there was an entire global system built on that, and the wealth and economic wealth of the system was built on that.
What kind of support is needed at this point?
I continue to say, I don't mean to sound like a stuck record, but I commend WASN and yourself for broaching this subject and broaching this subject as the first discussion on your prime time. That's a start.
Okay.
The willingness to be open, honest, and true, to identify an issue, because people tend to put sports by the side as recreational only, not understanding the power of sport to impact, because sport is something that speaks to youth and young people.
Yes.
And if you want to help build their self-esteem, you have to ensure that the structures aren't destroying their self-esteem. So it is about awareness. It is about the willingness to have the conversations and the discussion to be able to move forward. You know, I'm not saying that we should live in the past or that we should become prisoners of the past, but I think people who say that are being hypocrites.
Yeah. Do you think that, well, not do you think, what kind of policy and legislation should be put in place? Because we have athletes who, you know, are abroad, with teams abroad, who represent us abroad at these international events.
Well, to be honest, there's a saying that you can't legislate good behavior. If that was so, then the laws on the books would stop crime and corruption and bribery. To me, it's about awareness. It's becoming informed and educated. That way we could, you know, just as how you train people, athletes, to deal with the media, you have to prepare, you know, knowledge is power, and to be prepared is important in how to deal with these things, because it could very well foster an us versus them scenario.
Right.
And, you know, sports is supposed to be a unifying power that makes a positive difference to society. So to me, it's about awareness, these types of conversations, acknowledging that the global sports movement is built on certain structures and getting them and all, the others, the global community, for us to sit down and talk about racism.
Right.
You know, and don't be performative and hypocritical and just do it for a PR, just to feel good in a moment, and then you move on, because the people who are subject to racism live with it every day, because none of us, none of us can change the color of our skin or the texture of our hair. So we have to live with it every day, and it's a global community now.
Yeah, definitely. How do we move forward, and what is the work, some of the work that the organization is doing in terms of diplomacy and inclusion?
It's about being resilient. Of course, you can't just articulate or re-articulate what the problem is. You have to be part of the creation of solutions. And for me, it is about appreciating issues of human rights, and that is a human right. It is about, you know, in particular, when you look at the Caribbean, the conversation about reparation and reparative justice is an important one that triggers people the wrong way. But I think it is important. So, for example, when you look at the Commonwealth sports movement and the Commonwealth Games Federation, which began as the British Empire Games in 1930. So in a very real way, the Commonwealth Games, it moved from the British Empire Games to the British Empire, and Commonwealth Games to the British Commonwealth Games, to now, since 1978, the Commonwealth Games. It's a bit of a rebrand, but its origin was an empire.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've said that from the perspective of the Commonwealth Games Federation and the Commonwealth Sports Movement, it needs to be part of the reparation and reparative justice. I've proposed and suggested that a reparation fund be set up by the Commonwealth Games Federation, where funding is provided to assist sport development in the Commonwealth sports development in the Caribbean, using the percentage or portion or contribution from what is called reparation payments. That, to me, in terms of that narrow thing, we also have to be committed, not just as institutions, but personally, to non-racism and non-discrimination. And it is something that, just as you would want to talk about the requirements of the financial intelligence unit and full disclosure and source of funds, we must hold the spotlight to discrimination in all forms, wherever it may exist, whether historical or not.
Right. So accountability. Accountability.
Accountability and transparency. There's nothing wrong in apologizing for past sins, if you want to use that word.
Yeah.
And many organizations aren't willing to do that. Many societies aren't willing to do that. Many governments aren't willing to do that. And that is important.
Yeah. Before we wrap, what advice would you give to aspiring athletes, aspiring players who are coming up? They want to be a part of the sport. They have started already. They may be on a junior team or something. You know, what do you tell them in terms of navigating what to expect?
Preparation, like in everything else, you have to be prepared to perform physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and cognitively. And that goes back to, in the context of this is a conversation about sport and sport organization, the need to have a proper long-term athlete development structure and people development structure, if you want to call it that way, that's built on addressing not just the physical needs, but the mental, emotional, cognitive, as you just put it in the generic way, mental health. That's important.
Yeah.
You know, as I said, it's something we need to do because this generation of youth and young people are facing so many challenges, especially coming out of the COVID pandemic, that we need to face upfront that racism is a pandemic, especially in this week, because we don't get much opportunities to highlight it legitimately. Yeah. Tuesday, the 21st, was the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. On the 25th, Saturday coming this year, it is the International Day for the remembrance of the victims of the slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah. So as you said, what was the word you used? Stop sleeping on yourself?
Stop sleeping on yourself.
That's so apt today.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian Lewis, for joining us, for having this conversation. We definitely will check in with you to further talks on this. It is important. We take a short break. When we come back, we have lots more in store for you. Stay with us.